もしろえせずつれなけし腹くれくしの心えき
Boat People is the fourth feature film made by director An Huy, and her third project to engage with the broad topic of Vietnam, following From Vietnam in 1978 and The Story of Wu Viet in 1981. An Huy began her career studying at the London Film School before becoming the assistant to renowned director King Hu and forging opportunities to direct in television. She worked at Television Broadcasts Limited, the Independent Commission Against Corruption, where 2 of her 1-hour episodes of ICAC were banned, and Radio Television Hong Kong, where From Vietnam was made as part of the Below the Lion Rock series. This trajectory was not unusual for a group of filmmakers that came to be labeled the Hong Kong New Wave. The Cantonese film industry had collapsed in the 1960s, competing with the popular Mandarin language output, including the Shaw Brothers studio, and failing to engage with a younger audience reared alongside the growth of capitalism. Despite this disarray, younger filmmakers found it difficult to gain entry to the industry, either educating themselves abroad, entering into the television industry, or both. Eventually, these filmmakers, who included An Huy, Tsui Hark, Patrick Tam, and Alan Fong, were given the opportunity to make films by the end of the 1970s, which were starkly different from what preceded. Their treatment of local urban stories had a raw, kinetic quality that suited stories of crime and new approaches to genre films. Though many critics observe the influence of Western aesthetics stemming from these filmmakers' overseas educations, the attention to local detail in the films was vital in re-engaging a contemporary audience. This can be attributed to the localization policy of the television stations, where many of these filmmakers earned their early experience, while some films also exhibit a similarly local aesthetic influence from 1950s Cantonese social melodramas that had been resurrected on late-night television. This mix of aesthetics is especially apropos for Huy, whose early films occasionally have the action choreography associated with the new wave and thrilling genre elements, but lean heavily on the melodramatic components. Indeed, of the group of filmmakers associated with the new wave, Huy is somewhat unique for how long she resisted delving entirely into more commercial modes of filmmaking. Boat People is exemplary of this mix of melodrama and action, where a mix of the personal and the political is used to draw audiences interested in films concerning contemporary Hong Kong subjects. Boat People was initially produced by the SIL Metropole Organization Limited and sought to condemn the Hanoi government following Chinese foreign policy, before Huy pivoted the film's focus to sympathize with the people living in nations with totalitarian governments, especially when they flee to other nations. The film had 2 points of reception, at home and abroad. In Hong Kong, the film was a box office success, earning 15.5 million Hong Kong dollars, a fact many critics attribute to the Chinese factor, or more broadly, how films of the 1980s fostered allegorical readings that pertain to anxieties over the impending 1997 handover to China from Britain. In this case, North Vietnam is read as China and South Vietnam as Hong Kong. Playing out of competition in Cannes and receiving an international release, Boat People received a good deal of positive notice from foreign press, including Serge Daney and David Denby, though a Village Voice triumvirate of Hoberman, Shafransky, and Saris were emblematic of the criticism of the film as one-sided, simplistic, and overly sentimental. Beyond this potential misreading of Hong Kong stylistic tropes, Huy, for one, suggests the violence was actually downplayed. There is the more scholarly look at how the film withholds information that would more fairly balance the representation of the government. Stephen Teo points out that the tense and torturous demining process was actually for mines initially laid by the South Vietnamese soldiers and performed by those same soldiers alone. How can these wildly diverging readings apply to the same film, given its supposedly pointed political nature? In contemporary interviews, An Hui consistently resisted taking a political stance on the subject from which the film could be read. Indeed, it is precisely this personal engagement with a subject that overlaps with a political situation that best exemplifies her relationship with the new wave. Concerned with contemporary socio-political issues while rooting the representation in a personal, subjective realm that is also steeped in Hong Kong's film history. Though the critical discourse surrounding Boat People focuses almost exclusively on how political or apolitical it is as a text, rarely do readings of the film focus on how it articulates its perceived perspective. This essay seeks to identify formal motifs in the film and consider its aesthetic in relation to its themes of the political and the personal that have been articulated by critics, and what this approach means for the film. The slipperiness of the representation of the political climate of the film, and what an outsider can glean from these events, ultimately rises to the fore in Boat People. Hui harnesses the subjectivities of the supposed victims' accounts and the journalist reporting the events, pairing them with the inflection of local and Western influences on the film's aesthetic and the audience's own China factor reading lens, to illustrate precisely how the personal and political necessarily merge. An Hui's emphasis on the subjective perspective of the protagonist, Akutagawa, a photojournalist, and the film itself is present in the very first scene of the film. Patricia Brett Ahrens sees Akutagawa as necessary to achieve a perspective on the events being depicted, due to his status as neither an exile nor refugee, despite having done extensive interviews with Vietnamese refugees in Hong Kong. Yet it is through him that the subjective formal devices that blur the personal and the political are achieved, what Ahrens calls Hui's expressionist quality, though she believes it has vanished in this film. The film lacks the experimentation with flashbacks and voiceover narration to establish an interior subjectivity, but this thematic interest is not absent completely. Instead, Hui's interest in subjective point-of-view shots is found throughout the film to problematize notions of documentary realism and political truth. The very first scene of the film establishes this motif, illustrating how the film's camera is synonymous with Akutagawa's, which we understand to be his own subjective framing of a situation. This means that not only what he shoots, in this case the parade, is mediated by his choice, but also what he is not shooting, revealed to be the injured boy in the alley that he eventually finds. Politically, this shift shows how for Hui's films themselves, the political exists as a backdrop for stories about individuals. The film offers no context for the parade or the broader political climate. Instead, the camera moves as fluidly as Akutagawa, cutting alongside his shots. And after he discovers the boy, there's an emphatic cut back to the parade that curtails both the pursuit of the child and knowledge of his situation by reminding him and the viewer of the task at hand. That parade, and the politics it symbolizes, are also not further pursued, as Hui illustrates this tension between representation before even the title card. If the first scene does its duty in establishing the formal and thematic motifs, the second makes the project explicit. Looking only at the dialogue, there is a teacher instructing his students how to behave for the camera in order to influence the representation for international eyes. Similarly, the film again mirrors the subjective view of Akutagawa's camera as he takes portraits of the children, before reprising this angle when Akutagawa himself is greeted. Even when he is not literally taking photos, the film draws parallels to how he would shoot the scene. The representation of this school and the new economic zones it is an example of is idyllic. Pastoral lighting, fun and games, and matched with sweeping camera movements. Of course, as the instructor's discussion of how to best represent oneself foreshadows, this is not a true representation, which Akutagawa will later realize. With the direct connection between how the journalist mediates his photos and the film itself established, there are other motifs throughout the film that corroborate this perspective. The planimetric shooting style of the children, not only mirrored in the film's camera position, recurs with many of the reverse shot setups throughout the film. Rather than showing a traditional over-the-shoulder position, each shot depicts the speaker in a straight-on manner, which owes more to Yasujiro Ozu's unique formalist qualities and the subject matter of melodramas than politically driven cinema verite or even a traditional Hong Kong action film. These are shots that accentuate the heightened subjective reality and achieve this through a mixing of stylistic influences on Hui, emphasizing mediation while articulating the personal element of the story. Ahrens locates boat people as a turning point in Hui's career, where a tendency toward sentimentalism is born and results in a growing interest in melodrama within her oeuvre. Indeed, there are several shots early in the film that convey the placement of the camera in the physical space of the story by the use of narratively irrelevant objects in the foreground, despite the action of the scene localized in the background. These moments are potentially the most obvious in their stress on the image as composed and thereby mediated. Conversely, though complementary to this point, the shots of mirrors in the film emphasize the difficulty of understanding the provenance of a shot, and therefore its mediation, simply by looking at the image itself. There are two scenes that begin with a shot in a mirror, without the viewer knowing that the image has been mediated in this fashion, before it is revealed to be a mirror. Notably, in both instances, the narrative content of the scene focuses on nationality and its problematic nature. When Akutagawa is introduced to Officer Nguyen's would-be French cultural outpost, and again when Akutagawa meets his Japanese colleague to discuss the false sense of the new economic zone he has received in that pointed second scene of the film. In both cases, the image is misleading in similar ways to what it depicts, where national identity is slipping, or worse, deceptively conveyed. While there's a formal connection between a political story told through the subjective lens of a series of individuals, the story also hints at how Akutagawa projects meaning upon a situation. Namely, what he initially thought was a desperate situation, which he later retracts after visiting a vetted new economic zone, before changing his mind once again after meeting Cam Huang, her family, and Tu Min. The positive new economic zone was where conversation lingers on how the children present themselves for international readings, while the more stark revelations occur in a more urban space, where the back alley outside the celebratory parade at the beginning is charged with meaning. The meaning derived here is far from denotative, however, which Akutagawa admits early on. Yet the film privileges this space, utilizing it as the area for subsequent political revelations, and formally framing the space as a physical conduit to understanding. Whenever possible, this passageway is shown with a depth of field that conveys a spatial understanding, while the blocking takes advantage of what can be seen and not seen in each instance. It further unites the generic mixing, where melodramatic moments and thrilling action both occur. By the end of the film, the alley also serves to articulate the transnational element of the film. It is used by the family to escape Vietnam, and is also the point where Akutagawa's international balancing act is expunged by the cleansing fire of North Vietnam's totalitarian regime. It is here that Hui's personal inflection on the story is most visible. Apart from the sympathy established for Cam Huang's family throughout the film, it is clear that the escape here is vital to retain their national identity in the face of the North Vietnamese, rhyming with the image of the flag draped upon Cam Nguyen's brother's remains earlier in the film. The alleyway serves as both an entree into understanding another culture, but also escape to yet another political space. The hope for Hui is that this new space is more sympathetic to these individuals than the North Vietnamese regime depicted here. though the potentially unintentional reading of the North Vietnamese as a potential look at China for Hong Kong citizens in the future shows the difficulty in predicting interpretations. Patricia Brett Ahrens identifies the search for personal identity within the increasingly complex notion of national identity as the key theme in Hui's body of work, and in Boat People we can observe the complexity manifesting at the aesthetic level. Indeed, its varied readings from critics, who almost all discount its formal project, show how easily the film can be viewed to be a simplistic reduction of a politically ambiguous situation for melodramatic purposes. However, as we've observed, the subtle ways within which the personal and political elements of the story intermingle, especially based on the vantage point from which these matters are viewed, are what makes the situation so complex. National identity and the judgments made toward the situation depicted, be it a mischaracterization of the North Vietnamese government, empathy toward the South Vietnamese plight, grappling with modern-day diaspora, or an analogy for Hong Kong anxieties surrounding the 1997 handover, depend upon the lens through which it is viewed. Indeed, Hui herself would become more interested in the issue of the handover and melodrama in equal measure as her career continued, while the impact was not lessened by these two elements overlapping. Boat People, for example, was banned in China as anti-communist, and this led to a 10-year moratorium on its screenings in the still British-ruled Hong Kong. Regardless of its supposed sentimentality, there is a politically provocative quality to the film that lies precisely in its melodrama and largely unnoticed formal elements. If the Hong Kong New Wave was marked at its inception by a deliberate shift to rough local stories and revisions on popular genres of the past, Boat People takes these qualities and injects them with a formal complexity and self-reflexivity that, while problematizing its political reading, creates a more realistic depiction of how individuals engage with the political situations they observe and experience. I don't!